well, welcome everyone, and thank you for making it out in the rain. I know it's kind of a gross day, but glad you're here. So today we're going to be talking about myths from both Meso and North America. I'm going to be focusing on North America and Simon on Mesoamerica. But to get us started, we're actually going to start with Romanian historian and philosopher Mircea Eliade, who spent his career trying to figure out some of the most fundamental aspects of the human belief systems. And in his work, he emphasizes things like the importance of the center, and like the importance of duality, things like good and evil, now and later, the sacred and the profane, light and dark, past and present. I could go on and on and on. And he focuses on these things. And in doing so, he recognizes that twins regularly show up in the iconography of places all over the world as symbols of this sort of universal dichotomy. So for example, we've got up now objects from the Penn Museum collections. I basically went in, did a quick search of the Penn Museum collections for twins, and found objects from all over the place. Up at the top, we have 1,000-year-old fragments of gauze ponchos showing twin figures from Pachacamac, Peru. Down at the bottom here, a 2,000-year-old Nubian statue from Egypt showing male twins. Next, one series of a popular print created in the first half of the 20th century showing Chinese Buddhist deities, Ho-Ho and Er-Shen, twin gods of harmony. Figurines from Ur in Iraq showing the twin gods perhaps as much as 6,000 years old. And a 19th century painting from Calcutta, India, showing Rama and Barut, identical twin male characters. So this widespread notion of twins in collections such as ours and other museums all over the world shows that this type of character plays a really essential role in the symbolic systems of the entire world. But today we're going to focus in on the iteration of this twin story that exists in the Americas, all over the Americas in both Meso and North America. And I should point out now that it exists in South America as well, but we're stretching it to fit all of this into an hour already, so we're going to see what we can do. So before we tell you this story, I wanted to start just by very simply introducing the types of evidence that we're going to be drawing on today, and basically the types of evidence that are available to archaeologists to access these sorts of fundamental stories and belief systems. The first and perhaps the most straightforward way, of course, is to access these things through the written records of the ancient people themselves. For example, here we've got images of the Dresden Codex. This is the oldest known book written in the Americas. It consists of 39 sheets of flattened fig bark covered in a lime paste and then inscribed with highly accurate, say, astronomical tables, almanacs, ritual schedules. It's about 8 inches tall, nearly 12 feet long when you stretch it out, and covered on both sides with about 350 glyphs and associated images. This codex provides an absolutely enormous amount of information about the belief systems of the people who created it. However, the hero twins are not featured too prominently, though they are referenced in this one glyph that I pulled up here. Thus, much of our knowledge about this myth in the Maya world has to come from other sources. So where do we get this information? Many of these sources that we draw on date later in time when Europeans made contact with the indigenous people of the Americas and begin to record many of their stories. One of the most famous of these is the ethnographic manuscript is the Popol Vuh, a corpus of mythological and historical narratives from the post-classic Maya in Guatemala's Western Highlands. The Popol Vuh was recorded by the Dominican priest Francisco Jimenez, and you are going to hear a lot more about it today. It's famous for the telling of the Maya creation myth, as well as its classically epic tales of the hero twins, which we're going to focus on. So in the Maya world, we can turn to these sorts of documents to help us clarify and expand upon the written record of pre-Columbian people. However, in the US and in Canada, where we don't have any of those pre-Columbian written records, we have to use ethnohistoric documents created by the early French, Spanish, and English explorers to help us provide any written record of the belief systems of these early people. As Simon will discuss a great deal, ethnohistoric records such as these are heavily biased by the people who are writing them down, so imposing sort of a Western point of view onto indigenous stories. So we still need to move past these ethnohistoric documents as well, and in order to augment these limited and very biased records, many archaeologists turn to ethnography. Ethnography meaning the stories and belief systems that are being told in indigenous communities today, many of which are related to the stories and belief systems that were characterizing the prehistoric populations in these places as well. By speaking to the descendant communities today, ethnographic research aimed at documenting these cultural traditions has taken place in indigenous America from the very early period, here's an image from 1916, up until today. Now we're going to go just one step further. In both places where written records and places that lack them entirely are concerned, the material record is absolutely essential to really understanding these myths, stories, and histories as they were told by past peoples. So here we're going to come to the main focus of our talk, to archaeology and iconography. So the material record, of course, is accessed through archaeology, through the excavation of sites, through looking at assemblages of features and of artifacts, and then importantly for our talk today, based on the iconographic images that are inscribed upon many of those objects. The study of iconography, so literally meaning picture writing, in archaeology focuses on the identification, description, and interpretation of the content of images rather than just their style. So not necessarily interested in how the images are depicted, but what is the content that is actually being depicted. Much of the iconographic corpus that we're going to be talking about today is figural, meaning that it shows both human and non-human figures engaged in various activities, surrounded by indications of the world that they live in. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how the hero twins figure prominently in the iconography of both Meso and North America. So just to provide you with one really quick example of what an archaeologist does when they're trying to use iconography to understand what is being depicted on a particular object, let me show you one very brief example. This is a design of a Mississippian shell gorget found in the American South. On it, there are a number of incised designs, and looking at it at first, it may be hard to imagine that it's depicting something other than just a design, but rather some sort of scene in a story. But in fact, it does. So to begin to understand this story, we have to start by pulling this gorget apart into its various meaningful pieces. So here we go at the bottom with the various pieces that are independently meaningful on this gorget. Now, doing this is not necessarily straightforward. You may have looked at this and figured out some sort of different way of dividing these up than what we that work in the American South do. But the reason is you have to know a particular vocabulary. You have to understand the words that people are using or the images that people are using to put these stories together. And that vocabulary can only be built up through repeated exposure, much like learning any language would be. So here we've got a series of symbols. Down at the bottom, we have a very simple cross thought to represent the center. Around that, we have a sort of stylized sun thought to represent the sun in the above world. Then we've got this sort of swirly four-cornered motif thought to represent the four corners of this earth on which humans and animals walk around. And then we've got four creatures, four birds that are living somewhere within this scene. So based on this study of iconography, you can take things apart into their different pieces and then add dimensions of the story back together that were not there before. So in essence, taking a two-dimensional object and making it three-dimensional by adding space, recognizing what exists in this world, what exists in the above world, or even adding a fourth dimension by adding time, and you'll hear some of those messages today. So you'll see Simon and I do this process many times today, but the vocabulary that Simon is working with is much more complex than mine. He has a much better understanding of it because of the amount of work that's been done on the iconography of Mesoamerica. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to him, and I'm going to ask for your patience when you get to my section in understanding that I'm still slowly but surely learning this language.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so to discover the hero twins, to delve into this particular kind of past, we need to start in a particular place. This is the site of Ishimche. It's representative here of the highlands of Guatemala. So this is volcanic highlands. It's not a lot of people's image of Central America. It's not very hot. It's very often rainy and cold. But it's the place where there was a great flowering of Maya culture towards the end, what we call the post-classic period, and the 500 years or so before the Spanish arrived. Now, the highlands are home today to probably the most traditional people in the entire Americas. Maya people have preserved more of their traditions, more of their ideas, more of their ritual practices than just about anywhere else. This is a ceremony I was at in 2006. There is an altar, and the various spirits and gods are called to, and offerings made. It's very different. It's not a replica. It's not an exact translation of what would have happened in the pre-Columbian past. It's an ongoing tradition which is evolving all the time. And there, really, in the distance, you can see the site of, or the town of Chichicastenango. Chichicastenango is the center where the hero twins is made real for us. Without what happened there in the 18th century, we would have extreme difficulty in putting any of this stuff together. Now, we are thankful to Francisco Jimenez. He was a parish priest who came to Chichicastenango in 1701. And sometime between 1701 and 1704, he made a copy of an Amaya document. Now, this document wasn't made of hieroglyphs, it wasn't of drawn pictures. It was already in the Roman alphabet, and it had been made by indigenous people, indigenous clerics, we actually know very precisely, somewhere between 1554 and 1558. So these were first-generation people. These were people who had grown up in an indigenous Maya world, but were now enculturated, had learned the Roman script, were actually working for the church. And what they did was set down their own history of the world, very much in reaction and somewhat in resistance to what was being taught in the church itself. It's really a remarkable document. It was squirreled away, it was looked after, it was cared for. But Jimenez, who spoke excellent Quiche Maya, which is the language of this particular part of the Guatemala highlands, managed to see it. And they trusted him enough that he was able to produce a copy. He made his own translation. So it's written in Roman alphabet, but in Quiche language, and he produced a Spanish version. That particular version is now lost. It used to be in the university in San Carlos, not that far away, but it's disappeared. Fortunately, he made his own second copy, and that has survived. It's now in Chicago. Now, the Popol Vuh, as all these multiple editions suggest, has become something of a sort of central religious motif, not just for the ancient Maya, but for indigenous people in the Americas. And it's often called the Maya Bible, a great epic and myth. And those things are to some extent true. But we have to understand a number of different things about it. One is it was written not from a pure perspective, but one that was already inculcated by Christian ideas. And it had very particular purposes, very particular political purposes. The first half is very mythological, but the second half is really about the lineages, about the kings, about the lords, about the nobility of the Quiche Maya, and it tries to establish their authority. So the text itself is, as I say, written in Quiche Maya, and then with a Spanish translation. It is quite, a relatively long document, and we're only going to be concentrating on the parts that relate to the hero twins. And this is not a traditional breakdown of it. This is just my breakdown for the sake of this lecture. And it falls really into three parts. There's the backstory, and this is where we find out about the parents of the hero twins. They have very similar names, and they live on the surface of the earth. They're already deities, and they're called down into the underworld. They play ball. They're skilled ball game players. And they're forced to face the underworld lords, not just in playing the game, but also with a series of trials, a series of tests. And very, very quickly, they fall down. They actually fail the tests. They have to go to the House of Darkness with 2 cigars, and they're told that they have to keep them alight all night. The cigars are already lit, so you can see there's not really very much time. Surprise, surprise, by the time the morning comes, the cigars are burned out, they've failed the test, and they're sacrificed. One brother, at this point, somehow disappears from the story altogether, and the father of the hero twins is cut into pieces and buried in the middle of a ball court. Now, this is, as you can imagine, is not really the end of the story. So what happens is that a tree is grown up, or in some versions or some tellings of the story, a head, his severed head is put into the tree. Now this tree, this fruit, magically come to life. It had been a dead and barren tree. And the fruit are both fruit and they look like his face. And in fact, these are homonyms in Maya languages. A young, beautiful daughter of one of the death gods happens to go by the tree and the fruit talks to her. He seduces her. He ultimately spits into his hand, which is a metaphor for semen, and she is impregnated and becomes pregnant. She has to escape. The Death Lords are going to be very, very angry when they discover that she is pregnant, and indeed they are. They order her sacrifice. But through various kind of magical means and through animals that help her out, she escapes and she follows their instructions to climb up back to the surface of the earth. On the surface of the earth, she lives with her grandmother. She has to persuade her. She's a very cranky old woman, and she's not at all interested in this woman she's never met who claims that she's carrying her grandchildren. But eventually she does persuade her, and the boys grow up with their twins. They have a twin brother set as well. Those are people that they have to kind of battle against in sort of childhood years. They become ball players, they are maize growers, they do various magical things. But the first really big test is when they take on Seven Macaw. Seven Macaw is a giant bird, a bird who claims to be the sun and the moon. He is a false sun. He's very arrogant. He's always boasting about his riches and all the jewels that he owns. And in fact, his body is made up of jewels and to some extent. So they really resent this arrogance and they decide to take him down, and they use a blowgun shot to hit him in the face, disable him, and then when he tries to recover, they use false medicine to destroy his power. So that's one of the great evil forces that they've eradicated. They next move to his two sons. This is Sipak Na, who is basically a huge metaphor for the surface of the earth. He's part crocodile, he's part fish. They trick him and they manage to turn him into stone. Kabra Khan is another brother, another son of the great Macaw, and they poison him. So this is really about eradicating the earth from big monsters, because ultimately they'll be human beings which don't exist at this time.
Louder, please.
I can try. If they can turn me up a little bit, that might help as well. Yeah, it's a voice mic, so it's not to do with how close I am. So having succeeded against these two great sets of monsters in the real world, or on the surface world, they find themselves called down into the underworld by the same death gods that had sacrificed their father. And they face the same challenges. They have to go to the house of darkness and keep those cigars alight. But they play a trick. They manage to get fireflies to sit on the end of their cigars and make them appear as if they've been alight all night. They go to the house of jaguars where they're expected to be eaten, but instead they bring bones with them and make the jaguars completely happy eating bones, a bit like dogs. By each day, they're playing the Death Lords at the ball game, which is what we're seeing here, and pretty much every day is a tie. Certainly the hero twins are not so good that they can beat these excellent supernatural players. And then the very last night of this series, they have to sleep over in the House of Bats. The House of Bats is full of vampires, and they're particularly nasty vampires because they don't just drink your blood, they cut off your head. Very, very dangerous. They magically, their great talent is as blowgunners. This is the weapon that they had used to strike the great bird, and they climb inside their blowgun to wait out the night. What happens, unfortunately, is in the morning they look out, or one brother looks out, to try and see if the dawn has arrived when they'll be safe. It hasn't quite arrived. A bat comes down and cuts off his head. Naturally, this being a magical story, what happens is the head becomes the ball, and the ball is used in the ball game until they find more trickery and magic to get it back. So by now we're down here through the trials and the games, and we're on to sacrifice and resurrection. They realize they can't defeat the Lords of Death, the ball game, so they fake their own death. They willingly submit to their own sacrifice. The Lords of Death are delighted. They've really been spending days and days and days trying to get rid of these irritating guys. And what they do is they grind their bones into powder, into meal, and they throw it into a river. Now, in a little bit like a kind of sped-up version of human evolution, the meal turns into fish, and the fish turn into animals that climb out of the river, and they're reconstituted. In order to get their own back, in order to wreak revenge on the Death Lords, they have to impersonate somebody else. They have to wear masks, and they pretend that they're entertainers. What they do is they walk around the underworld and find a dog and then kill it. And then they put the head back on the dog and it comes back to life. It's a great trick. They become famous for this, and ultimately the death gods are imploring them, they're begging them to come and do their tricks. So they come and they burn down the palace of the underworld and then build it all up again. They even take one brother, takes the other, and kills him, cuts him into pieces, and then puts him back together again. At this point, of course, the death gods are beside themselves with enthusiasm. This is a fantastic thing, and they volunteer to be cut to pieces and put back together again. And as you might guess, they decide that maybe they won't do that. And instead, revealing who they really are, they kill the Lords of Death and do not restore them. At this point, they can go back to the ball court, and they can resurrect their father. And they bring him back to life, and then in the story that's in the Popol Vuh, one brother turns into the sun, and the other turns into the moon, and they rise up into the sky. Okay? So this is the story that the Popol Vuh provides us with. It's a skeleton, it contains core elements, but it's something that was written down in 1554, after many, many changes had happened in Maya society. So the trick, what we're doing today as archaeologists, iconographers, epigraphers, trying to sort out what this story meant and how it worked in the deep past. So we find something like this. This is an image from a classic Maya vessel, which was probably from about 600 to 700 AD. And you can see the head in the tree, the same kind of head which gives forth the sputum, the spit, which inseminates the underworld beauty. And that sort of sets off a kind of chain of reactions of looking at different images and making sense of them. And because I'm telling the story kind of chronologically, we'll kind of nip around a little bit. But I want to start here by showing the Maya maze god. Here he is, he's beautiful, and he's the analogous figure to the father. In the Popol Vuh, he never describes him as the maze god, but it's very clear that maze is what this whole story is about. He is in the water, and he is being clothed by these underworld women. So this is his spouse and her sisters. And then with it, we get these two extra figures. Close up on them. One of them is sort of very human, and the other is sort of partly animal. He has this jaguar pelt around his mouth. And through various means, we can reconstruct how the classic Maya version of these people was put together. The two brothers, in the Popol Vuh, he's called Hunahpu, but in the classic period, he's called Hunahau, and they both mean one lord. Ahau, apart from being the word for lord, is also a day sign, so he's embedded into the calendar. If we go to his brother, so Hunahau is basically the prototype lord, he's the prototype king. His brother is Shpalamkei in the Popol Vuh, but in the classic period his name was something like Yashbalun. He's also part of the calendar because he is the head variant for the number 9. Yeah? And whereas we go back, we can see that the diagnostics for Hunahau is this spot in particular. There's a few other things, but the spot is a big one. And for Yashbalun or Shpalamkei, it's this wild animal clothing and animal skin. So one brother seems to be the lord of the cities. The other is the lord of the forest. He's the lord with the closest association with animals. And we have a number of characters that we begin to recognize from the Popol Vuh. We have the big bird, the bird who carries all these jewels and big displays on many, many vessels, going right back into the pre-classic era, which is before 200 AD, so let's say from 400 BC to 200 AD. And we have the blowgunning scene. This is an early classic vessel. It's a double cylinder. We see the same bird, which we call generally the principal bird deity, and both brothers. We have Hunahau with the blowgun, and we have Yashbalun, who is sort of tempting him with a piece of fruit. He's sort of kind of luring him, I think, and then the shot goes out. A little bit of a close-up so we can see Hunahau's face. Interesting quiff. And this is Izapa Stela 2. So here we see the bird who's kind of pointing down, and we see the two brothers, and here we see a fruit tree. In fact, if I read just from the Popol Vuh, it says, at length, 7 macaw, the bird, perched on the nance tree, which is a kind of round fruit, to feed, was shot. Hunahpu directed a pellet straight from his blowgun into his jaw. 7 macaw cried out, sailing over the top of the tree and landing on the ground. So this is pretty much, this is a stop frame animation going on here. And it's interesting to think that this is from around 300 BC. This next scene, which is ostensibly the same thing, although we actually see the blowgun again, is from around 700 AD. So already in the deep Maya past, we have 1,000 years of religious tradition. Because of the hieroglyphs, we can actually read this. We know this is M-Chan. This is the descent from the sky. And indeed, here we see the bird coming out of the sky, falling out of the tree. Hunahau with his spots. And then back at Izapa, again in this deep time in the pre-classic, we find not only this part with a crucial part of the Popol Vuh when they actually attack the bird is that their first attempt fails. And the bird grabs hold of Hunahpu and cuts his arm off. And so when the archaeologists first saw the standing figure here with this spare arm up with the bird and this stump issuing out blood, it was very clear that here again is the origin of this particular story. We see it again in the late classic, so around 700 AD. Here is Hunahau, and here is the bird. And we have a nice little text here. It says that Chak-a-uk-ab was chopped his hand. And you can see here, it looks a little bit like damage, but it isn't. This actually is a stump here. It's the severed hand of Hunahpu. Now, all these versions we've seen are with the principal bird deity, but there's another version of this deity which is a macaw, which is much more consistent with what the Popol Vuh says, because the bird is called 7 macaw. But you see the same magical wings, which basically identify this as a deity. And as a macaw, we see continuity. So this is now into the post-classic period. This is the Madrid Codex, and it was probably painted somewhere around 14 or 1500. And again, the macaw with the arm in its mouth. Here too, this is excavated stucco facade at the site of Copan. Here it's really very much under excavation. But here in the museum, a replica has put the pieces back together again. So it looks rather different. We have, of course, the macaw head, but we have these miniature macaw heads at the ends of these feathers. And then we have this giant head in the center. And you can see, just about, hanging out of that mouth is the arm. And in fact, the arm is so complete, it's even got the dot to tell you that we're talking about Hunahau. Now, the bird is, iconographically is rather strange. This is not a Maya thing. This is something that comes from central Mexico. And specifically the iconography of Teotihuacan. Now, for a long time, we've really seen no tangible connections between the mythology of the Maya and the mythology of central Mexico. And the more recent findings to do with this story are bringing the two of them together. So Teotihuacan, apart from the famous vastness of its architecture, has many, many compounds full of beautiful murals. The number excavated is a tiny percentage. There is generations of work to be done at Teotihuacan, all of which I think will reveal amazing information and amazing iconography. They've already discovered Maya hieroglyphs painted on the walls of Teotihuacan, where you have some sort of enclave, you have some sort of group of people using it from the central Maya lowlands. And some of these murals at Teotihuacan show a bird. And it's a macaw, and it has the same macaw heads along its wings. Just out of the picture here is a blowgunner, and up here you see the tree, and it's a bird coming out of the tree. Well, that seems a little bit suggestive, but nothing like as suggestive as this very, very new find. So this has been very recently published by my colleagues in Denmark, and it's a bird from the same complex where those other paintings came from. And you can just see, well, again, because of the macaw heads everywhere, but this thing up here is the telling thing. It's the bloody arm. This is the first time that we've seen Teotihuacan express the same myth and show its pan-Mesoamerican identity with the Maya. To wrap up this sort of pan-Mesoamericanism, of course, Teotihuacan is collapsed at around 550 AD, so this is classic period. But into the post-classic, we find the same kind of thing. This is the Borgia Codex, which is ostensibly an Aztec document. This is from very, very close to the time of the Spanish conquest. And a tiny detail in it shows you the macaw with the arm. So even though, again, there's not one single reference in this really quite long volume to that myth, this gives the game away that they knew about it. Into the underworld, we enter the next part, which is where we have now descended, and we're going to play ball with the Lords of Death. Kings, this is a king from the site of Naranjo, can dress as hunahau. So, of course, the spots are the giveaway again. The ball game yoke, so this is part of the equipment. This is where you take the blow from these very large balls. This is not football. This is not something you use your feet. In fact, your feet are a foul. You're only allowed to use your hips, your elbows, and your chest. And the heavy yoke is basically to protect your most vulnerable organs. So here's the king in this sort of death iconography of crossbones. He is enacting the role of hunahau in the death ball game. But in fact, most of the time, rather ironically, kings decide to play the other side. They play the Lords of Death rather than the good guys. So here from Copan, you've had these captions that tell us this is the Death Lord here. But it says Ubah, Washaklahun Ubak Awil. He is one of the great kings of Copan. And he is dressed as the Lord of Death. And over here we have hunahau playing him a ball. They're playing a very, very heavy ball because this is solid stone. It's a mythological ball, presumably. And this even more beautiful example comes from a tiny, tiny site called Esperanza, but it's very likely it had been dragged from another site called Chincultic, right across in the western highlands of Guatemala, actually into Mexico. And here you see, this is the death god again. These shell iconography is part of his doing, and it tells us that it's the king. And just in the ball there, you see better in the drawing, is the head of hunahau. So this is the part of the story where the head has been chopped off by the killer bats and is now being played with. Later on, his brother will find this conniving means of having a rabbit distract them by pretending to be a ball, and they stick his head back on, all this kind of mythic stuff. So we're leading up to the kind of grand finale, which is the defeat of the Lords of Death. This is a vessel which is a very famous one, which is now in Princeton. We do see a rollout of it. These are photographs that Justin Kerr took by using a camera which wraps images, or unwraps images. And what we see, I think the drawing is slightly clearer, one of the great lords of the underworld. We don't know his real name, we call him God El. He sits with this very fancy cape and with an owl in his headdress full of feathers. He has lots of very nice young ladies to share time with. And he's out, he's really not aware of things. You can see that this lady is trying to nip this one on the ankle just to make her aware that something bad is happening outside. What's happening is a sacrifice scene. Two characters with axes are taking this death god, we know because of these darkness signs, with this sort of tail, this sort of serpent tail that comes out, and they're beheading him. This appears to be one of the executions, and for a long time there was a controversy really about what was the meaning of this scene. And I think Justin was right in arguing that these are the twins, and they are masked because this is the period when they're the entertainers, and they're now taking their revenge. In fact, I can say that we have proof positive of that. This is another vessel which more recently came to light. A drawing again makes it a little bit clearer, and it is a fussy scene, so let's break it up. Here we see the same character who's being sacrificed. There's that serpenty tail thing that comes out. He has death iconography, but his chest has been split open because someone has extracted his heart through his abdomen. So that's one Death Lord out of the way. The other one, the main king of the underworld, God El, the one who wears the fancy cape and the hat and the jewels, is being stripped naked. And the brothers, who are now perfectly identifiable as the two brothers, are disrobing and casting his stuff aside. So this is their overturning of that underworld rule. So what happens next? Another complex scene, which simplifies slightly. You see both brothers, and they have little pots that they're inverting, and out is coming snakes, and these snakes are representative of water. And what they're doing is they're watering the earth down here. For what end? Well, because they are bringing their father back to life. And through the surface of the earth, represented here as a turtle, breaks through the maize god. And this, of course, is a great metaphor, the metaphor of the cycling of the seasons, of the new shoot coming out of the ground. He's covered in jewels and green feathers, which are all the leaves, all the foliage of the maize plant. And you see the pot here very openly being used to water him. Yeah. One last episode we don't understand. We have, it's for the sake of talk, one puts together a coherent story, but in fact there are lots and lots of loose ends. At some point, the maize god and Hunahau come to the court of the sky ruler and make some sort of presentation to him. The sky ruler is a complicated character because he is also the great bird. He is the bird who they've eradicated in another creation or another land. So we're still working on trying to pull this back into common sense, and hopefully over time, reading the glyphs and understanding the iconography will do that. And this is the Maya section. I will pass it over to Megan for the next section.
Thank you. So I'm now going to sort of move us northward into what is now the United States and Canada, and try and weigh the evidence for this myth in those locations. And Simon just said, for the sake of a talk, we try and put together a coherent narrative. Well, I'm going to say I'm going to do my very best job to do that, but we are much further behind in understanding the details of the iconography of the hero twins in North America. But for sake of argument, I'm going to start off with probably the clearest cut evidence for the North American hero twin myth. And this comes from the Mimbres region, marked here on the map, just there in southwestern New Mexico. As you can see, this is just across the border from Mexico, so we're not terribly far from the regions that we were just discussing. From about 800 AD to about 1150 AD, people in this region were creating these beautiful black on white bowls, many of which are depicted up here. And most common, they're depicting animals and geometric designs. But around AD 1000, figural art becomes a majorly huge portion of the iconography on membrace bowls. By interpreting this iconography, scholars have started to put together sort of a series of bowls that seems to depict the hero twin story in a way that very closely follows the hero twin story that Simon just told us about. Now, I should point out here that as a North American archaeologist, I tend to get very frustrated and annoyed when we try and claim Mesoamerican connections as the meaning behind all of the major cultural changes in North America. But here we've got some evidence for it that goes beyond just our assumptions about what Native North American people may have been able to do. And that is that about at the same time, around AD 1000, we see the appearance of macaw feathers, and in particular, these beautiful objects made out of brightly colored feathers that would not have been available in this particular region. So here we've got independent evidence beyond just the presence of the hero twins that there is Mesoamerican contact happening around AD 1000 between those people living in the Membrace region and those people living further south in Mexico. So let's very briefly take a look at the hero twins as it's told through these membrace bowls. After the birth of the twins, and much of this is going to sound familiar to you, they're brought to the surface of the earth, and the grandmother here is shown with the twins perched on a burden basket, probably representing the fact that it is now her burden to raise these twins. In membrace art, the twins are usually depicted dualistically. One is larger, the other smaller. One is right-handed, the other left-handed. One is slightly more masculine, the other slightly more feminine. Here, the larger right-handed twin carries a sunflower, perhaps as he was designated to become the sun, and then the left-handed twin carries a moonflower, perhaps because he was designated to become the moon. As in the Mayan story, the twins go on to many trials during which they must prove their strength and their ingenuity. Here, the larger right-handed twin is fighting against the seven macaw, or the great macaw. And this is supposed to depict, believe me, I recognize this looks nothing like a macaw. However, the thing that convinced everyone that this is probably what was being shown here is the fact that one of the twins' arms is shown inside the macaw's mouth without its hand, likely recognizing the fact that the hand was ripped off by this particular trial. In this next portrait, the twins are shown together, reunited once more. And in particular, we think that what this one is showing is the reuniting of this twin with his arm. So they're pictured side by side without their interior arms to emphasize the fact that the right-handed twin has his left arm back in this picture. So they've managed to get his arm back at this point in the story. After retrieving the arm, the twins must go on to fight the sons of the great macaw, and here we've got them fighting a particularly monstrous creature that matches that description of a mix between a fish and an alligator. This fits very well. There are a series of other bowls that show them fighting other monsters that may also fit in with the story, but for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to show you all of them here. In the underworld, after they leave the surface of the earth, they go to the underworld. They're set forth for a number of other trials, those that were also undergone by their brother or by their father and their uncle in previous times. And one of those was the task of smoking. In this particular tale, it appears that what they were able to do in order to keep their cigar lit through the entire night was to attach macaw feathers, right here, those bright red feathers that I just showed, to the end, making it look as though it was still lit, in the same way that they used fireflies to do that in the story that Simon told us. So in one final scene, the left-handed twin decapitates his brother, but this beheading is, as you learned, a sleight of hand performance. And in this particular instance, we see that the lifeline between these two brothers is still there, thus allowing the brother to be brought back to life. Here, the decapitator twin wears a mask depicting probably a horned serpent of some sort. And this is an extremely rare element on membrace painted bowls, but one that has parallel motifs more common in Mesoamerican iconography. And thus, the presence of sort of this motif, the hero twins myth more generally, and of course those macaw feathers, we have reason to believe that there was actual connection between Mesoamerica and the membrace region at this time. So this still begs the question, why is it that people in the membrace region were so willing to accept this myth, so willing to set aside the myths of their own culture and accept a Mesoamerican myth when it is brought into their region? And one of the best explanations for this currently is that the Mimbrace people would not have been particularly unfamiliar with the ideas that were being told in the hero myth story, and particularly with the themes of monster slaying, the themes of vengeance for a killed relative, the themes of duality in the twins themselves. And thus, they were quickly able to accept these things and sort of bring them into their already established belief system. And one of the reasons that we really believe this is that the twins figure very prominently in the mythology of the Dene, or the Navajo people, who are located around the Four Corners region, not that far north of where the Mimbrace people were. So the hero twins figure the most prominently in the Dene origin story. This is where people first enter the world on which they live today, and they find it covered in water and completely overrun by monsters. The first woman to give birth in this world gives birth to twins who turn out to be incredibly powerful and are charged with going out on adventures to rid the world of these various monsters. As you can see from these pictures, the twins are still very huge portions of the modern iconographic motifs used by Dene artists today in things like storybooks, things like baskets, also in ceramic motifs. In this particularly modern riff on the hero twins story, the boys, who are said to follow the trail of the rainbow throughout their adventures, it's always a piece of the rainbow that shows back up and tells them where to go next and how to defeat their current monster. Here they are waiting impatiently for the rainbow to swing by and pick them up again. So as you can see, this is currently something that is very, very prominent in Dene mythology. But for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on the fact that the hero twins myth is incredibly widespread in North America and in no way isolated to the Southwest, where we do believe we had contact with Mesoamerican populations. Stories of adventuring twins abound in the ethnohistoric record of Native groups from throughout the Great Plains, people like the Hidatsa, the Arikara, the Arapaho, the Midwest, groups like the Ho-Chunk and the Iowa, the South, the Caddo and the Cherokee, and the Northeast Iroquoian groups. The specifics of this myth vary dramatically from tribe to tribe, which makes my job here really difficult. But overall, many of these themes do tie these myths together and indicate both similarities with the Mesoamerican story and some important differences. The North American iteration, and you're just going to have to hold off on the pictures for a second while I tell you the story, because we didn't have a whole lot of iconography to depict this portion of the story. But the North American iteration concerns a pair of magical twins who were born from their pregnant mother when she was killed by a monster while their father is away. Often, if the father is portrayed as human, he's off hunting. If he's portrayed as divine, then he has returned to the divine realm. Upon their birth, the twins are separated. In some versions, one twin was never known, period, by his relatives, because one was born normally, where the other was born magically from the afterbirth that was tossed away after the birth of his brother. In other versions, the twins were separated as their mother's killer left one behind to be found by the relatives and took the other and discarded him either out in the woods or in a local spring or creek. But regardless of all of these details, one boy grew up civilized and the other grew up wild, something that should sound familiar to you from the Mayan myth. These are often portrayed as being, the wild twin is often portrayed as being raised by water creatures because he was thrown in the spring. And these boys have many different names, and depending on which group you're talking about, they translate to any number of things. But the most common themes are something like village boy and wild boy, or lodge boy and thrown away. So I'll be using those terms interchangeably throughout this to describe these twins. So eventually the twins are reunited when Thrown Away decides that he wants to come find his brother while their father is away. However, he always chooses to disappear immediately before the father comes. However, eventually, lodge boy or village boy decides that he's going to tell his father that his brother has been coming to visit him. When he does, in some tellings of the story, the father develops a plan to determine if wild boy is in fact his son. In other stories, he's just determined to figure out whether the boys are worthy of the special powers that their unusual birth bestowed upon them. And then in final tellings, the father knows that Wild Boy is his son, and he and Village Boy concoct some sort of plan to capture him and domesticate him, to bring him back to his family. After the boys are reunited and become part of the same family once again, they're given special tools and weapons of great power. These are often represented as bows and arrows, though occasionally shields and spears are also used. And despite being reunited, they always keep their dualistic nature. So one is sometimes portrayed as good and the other evil. One is more wild, one is more civilized, one is larger, one is smaller. But together they go on any variety of adventures to rid the world of monsters and to avenge the original death of their mother, showing, again, clear connections to both the Dene stories and the Mayan myth. I don't have time to go into all of these various adventures, but I do want to point out that various feats that they're charged with are seen as very similar to those that are depicted in the Mayan myth. So for example, they're charged with battling giant animals. They're charged with smoking a pipe without inhaling the smoke. They're charged with defeating godlike creatures in a game of Chunky, the North American version of the ball game. They're charged with killing themselves and reanimating themselves through special magic, on and on and on. In the end, the boys win their final battle, which allows them to bring their mother back, and they rejoin their father to become a complete family once again. In the only instances where the mother is not brought back to life, she's brought back instead as a corn plant. So again, very clear connections to the Mayan myth. The hero twins seem to loom very large in the ethnographic record of North American myths, and that's where all of this information that I've just provided you with comes from. But the real question becomes, can we trace how long these myths have been standing in these communities? And to do that, we have to turn back to the archaeology itself. In recent years, archaeologists have kind of settled this question, finding evidence that the hero twins story dates well before the period of contact with any external groups, be they in Mesoamerica or in the Southwest, in the eastern United States. And I'd like to spend the rest of my time showing you just a few of these examples. In this first example, we have a limestone tablet called the Thruston Tablet found in Sumner County, Tennessee. I'm going to overlay a drawing of this here just to make it a little bit easier to see. So what we have going on here are a series of scenes, and as I was talking about at the beginning with the iconographic record, we have to sort of pull those scenes apart to understand what is happening. What we think is being shown in this tablet is the very early instances of the hero twins meeting one another once again and then being granted their special powers and those weapons. So here in the first scene, we've got the two twins, and Simon pointed out a lot of things that allow you to identify the twins. We have those here as well. One is often depicted with lines on his face, the other with some sort of star or sun symbol, one with this central circle on his belly, and then the wild twin is portrayed as wearing an animal skin, where the domesticated twin or the civilized twin is depicted wearing more normal clothing. So here we believe that the twins are greeting one another. The extra arms there in the middle are probably a sign of motion, where they're going up to sort of meet in a high five-like gesture. Later in this story, we see the two twins independently going through their tests of strength to see if they're worthy of the weapons that they will be given. And here we've got one twin potentially battling with some sort of creature over here. He's holding a shield, while the other twin in the background is holding a spear, appearing to have already been given his implements worthy of his power. In the other scene on here, we see the opposite twin undergoing his test. Here, it's the test of smoking, perhaps indicated by him sitting inside this enclosure with a pipe, while his brother is outside, already having his bows and arrows and all of his weapons. So what we have here is a series of images carved onto one stone that seems to tell a small portion of the hero myth as it is preserved in the ethnographic record of Eastern North America. So in order to get the other pieces and to start to piece together this myth, we have to turn to other sites. And I'm going to show you just two very quick examples from rock art sites in Eastern North America. This first scene is from the Gottschall Rock Shelter in Iowa County, Wisconsin. This is very close to where I went to college and was kind of my introduction to the idea of the hero twins in North American iconography at all. I should say that this guy over here is actually the primary character that we have managed to figure out the story of. So if I were to give this talk only on North America, we'd be talking about this guy over here, this character of Redhorn, rather than about the twins who we think are depicted over here, because we're just slowly but surely putting together their story. But there are things you can see here that tie these guys together. You've got the central circular symbol. You've got the fact that they're dressed independently. You've got these sun or star symbols, and you've got lines on the face. In this particular telling, we believe that Redhorn here is meant to actually represent the twins' father. I want you to take note of the lines running down his body here. And then we've got other references on this same panel to aspects of the story that we aren't quite able to tie together, but likely represent things like the pipe smoking challenge that they undergo. Further south in Warren County, Missouri, we have Picture Cave, and this is an enormous sort of panorama of rock art, but I want to point out just two aspects. Here we've got this same striped figure off by himself, probably representing Redhorn. In this particular case, someday I'll come back and give you a whole talk about this guy. He's wearing this small human head as an earring. He who wears human heads as earrings is a character that we understand very well in Eastern North American iconography. But he was viewed as having given birth to twins, or having fathered twin sons. And those twin sons we think are depicted over here in Picture Cave. You can see they're carrying their bows and arrows, and they're wearing their elaborate headdresses. But perhaps one of the most interesting and the most compelling stories to me comes from the site of Cahokia, particularly one mound at Cahokia, Mound 72. So you may be slightly familiar with the site. Cahokia is an enormous site from the Mississippian period in St. Clair County, Illinois. And generally when we talk about Cahokia, we focus on things like the Grand Plaza, Monk's Mound up here in the corner. But today we're going to focus on this little odd mound down here, diminutive in size, oddly a kilter to the main axis of the site, and sort of set outside the main plaza, outside the palisade wall. Here's a modern picture of this mound. It's nothing that's going to blow your mind when you walk up to it, but it turns out to have been one of the most interesting things we've found at Cahokia yet. And that's because inside of Mound 72, we have found at least 272 human burials. Placed in this mound, likely over the course of only a few years in 6 major episodes. So when this was initially found, everyone chose to believe that this was the burial of the original Cahokian chief. This happens very early in the site's history, and there's one central individual who's depicted down here, and I'll zoom in on this picture a little bit for you, who was viewed as the chief. And all of these people put in sort of ritual sacrifice type ceremonies, like those that are reminiscent of what we hear about from Mesoamerica and from other parts of the world, indicating basically the power of this man, that when he died, they needed to do this. So before we decide on whether or not we agree on that interpretation, I want to go through the burials that are here. So we're going to focus in on this area first, and the individual we're the most interested in is this guy right here, who's laying on a cape of 20,000 marine shell beads. Basically laid out, probably sewn onto a skin in the shape of a falcon. That skin has now decomposed, but the beads are still there and show a very clear shape. Surrounding him are all sorts of burial goods, mica that must have come from the Appalachian Mountains, chunky stones and sticks, perhaps tying him to the challenge of playing the chunky game, hundreds and hundreds of arrow points. Here's an image of sort of a replica of his body from the Cahokia Mounds Museum, and then an actual excavation image of these points. These points were likely arranged in quivers. We've got points of different colors, probably representing the duality of this individual. But what really sells this is when they excavated him away and they removed these shell beads, they found another individual buried face down underneath him, so as if he was wearing the cloak on his back. So here we've got a very clear call to the twins myth. We've got a very clear burial of not one individual, but 2 individuals who are buried with all of these materials that are sort of evoking other aspects of this myth. To continue with the saga of Mound 72, I just want to point out a few of the other things. So after these individuals were laid to rest, all sorts of pits were dug in this location. And I should point out that these pits were dug to be exactly the right size for the people who ended up going into them. In one pit, there were 53 females showing evidence of being strangled and then arranged neatly in 2 rows separated by mats. All sorts of work has been done on these particular individuals, and we believe that they were probably immigrants from elsewhere, people that did not live at Cahokia, but were brought in for the purposes of this ceremony. In another area, we have, for example, this burial up here, which is of 4 young males who are lacking both their hands and their heads. Their arms are interlocked, and they've been interpreted as potentially representing the 4 cardinal directions. Down here, we've got 39 men and women violently killed. We have evidence that some were buried alive as their fingers are actually curved into the dirt underneath them in which they were buried. We have these individuals here, all men who died at various stages, not all for the purposes of this particular ceremony, but were carried to this location to be laid to rest on cedar planks, basically on stretchers, and laid very neatly in this particular pit. Chances are, based on the dietary work that's been done on these skeletons, they were elites. They were shown as eating much more meat and much smaller amounts of corn, where the opposite can be said for the individuals that were more violently killed. So what we have is this impression of the fact that people are coming to Cahokia specifically for the purposes of dying as a part of the ritual of the burial of these two individuals with the shell cloak. This fits more or less with what we originally thought, that this was a burial of an elite individual at Cahokia. However, recently we've started to reinterpret this as perhaps a telling of the hero twins myth, basically letting go of our Western idea that the only reason you would ever sacrifice yourself was for the purposes of a leader, and instead holding on to the idea that communal ritual and the sorts of reenactments of these important stories would have been essential to the continuing of the world of these people. And so rather than depicting this scene as a lord sort of taking a lesser individual, killing her and placing her into a pit, sort of in isolation from everything else going on, we can now paint a picture of this as a public ritual in which people would have been watching the enactment of the myths that basically settle their lives, basically tell them how their world began, explain the duality of good and evil, of night and day, and focus on the two twin characters of the hero twins.
So, as Meg mentioned at the beginning, we could have gone further south. We could have taken our academic boots and trod through the Darien Gap and down into South America, because some of the myths down there seem astonishingly similar to what we have. There's certainly one where twins are battling a giant harpy eagle and getting its feathers as a symbol of rulership for the lords of the jungle areas. So what we can attest is that the idea of twins, the idea of battling monsters, and the ways in which this transverses the surface of the earth, the underworld, and the sky is very common indeed. And this brings thoughts about where this story might have originated, where this story may have come from, in what way has it evolved in different places at different times. We don't really have enough idea about early contacts between these areas, and it seems much more probable that it's the groups of people who are traveling down from the Bering Strait along the coastlines from North America into South America who are bringing with them and developing this story, which then survives a bit like little rock pools all over the region. Now, as iconographers, epigraphers, archaeologists, we try and be as cautious as we can about these kinds of bits of information, because it's very easy to delude yourself sometimes. And there's something which has got the fancy name of a directional fallacy, where we look at things that survive today and then simply use that as a template. We look back in time and sort of try and pick things that match. And that's a kind of useful starting point. I mean, it's hard to know what else we would start with. But as we become more sophisticated, as we learn more, as we can piece together symbolic systems, writing systems, and see how they change over time, we can actually look for those myths in the past, trying to reconstruct them in their own time. When there's something in the Maya myth that doesn't fit something in the Popol Vuh, that will seem to be a bit of a problem. How can we find something which fits better? In fact, now we see, no, this has changed. These are things developing over time. That the Popol Vuh itself is the product of a cultural evolution. It was made with very, very specific aims in mind. And in that sense, it's a complex literary work, layered and layered with its own history of development. So in looking through into the past, we have a different kind of agenda, which is to make the past live and speak for itself. Maybe some final comments to make?
So just to throw up, as we're talking, a few of the many images that we've shown you today of the hero twins depicted across North America and across Mesoamerica. We hope that what we've been able to do is show you that despite all of the differences in these stories, all of the variations that exist between the story told in the Maya world, the story told by the Dene today, and the stories told on the archaeological objects found from the Mississippian period in eastern North America, that there are some themes, there are regular motifs both themes in terms of what the story is about, and also motifs in terms of how the twins are depicted, the types of characteristics that they have. And really, when you put this evidence together, we thought it would be best to end with a quote from Paul Radin, who said in 1949, so well before we were working on this talk, because of this wide distribution and because of the importance and significance attached to it everywhere, I feel that it is not an exaggeration to designate it, meaning the hero twins myth, as the basic myth of Aboriginal America. So he recognized this now. Simon and I recognized this, or he recognized this then, and Simon and I recognize this now. And we hope that you'll come away with sort of a curiosity about what we'll find in the archaeological record as we start to understand these iconographic vocabularies even better and are able to put together maybe the details of these stories as they were told prehistorically rather than as they're told today with our modern Western influences. So with that, I think we would be happy to take any additional questions that you have.